Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Usually when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's this expectation of, well, absolute sterility.
Oh, yeah, completely.
Right. You picture a pristine server room, perfectly climate controlled, maybe some flashing blue lights.
Data just seamlessly flowing across the screen.
Exactly. It's an environment where every single variable is strictly controlled.
It's clean, it's binary, and, it's predictable. I mean, we like to imagine the future being built in these flawless, dust-free laboratories where a single line of code just executes perfectly every single time.
But then you step into the world of traditional agriculture, and suddenly that pristine server room is completely replaced by a paddock.
Yeah, a muddy paddock.
You are dealing with weather, with mud, with stubborn livestock, and just unpredictable terrain. We're looking at an AI landscape that is honestly a completely muddy reality.
Which is exactly why this is the most critical frontier in technology right now.
Really, more than the generative stuff.
Absolutely. Because while everyone has been hyper-focused on screen-based AI, chatbots, image generators, text synthesizers, the real revolution is quietly happening in the physical world.
Right.
It is literally turning entire landscapes into testing grounds for autonomous technology that actually has to survive in the dirt.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the mission for today's deep dive is to go through this huge stack of sources we've got. We are looking at financial news, government press releases, and this really in-depth agricultural leadership report.
Lots of different perspectives there.
Yeah, and we want to figure out why billions of dollars are suddenly flowing into New Zealand for what they're calling physical AI.
A massive shift.
It is. I mean, for you listening, imagine taking the smart technology inside your phone or like the fitness tracker on your wrist and strapping it onto a 1,500-pound animal. That is exactly what is happening right now.
And it's not a small experiment. There's this agri-tech startup called Halter that is basically the poster child for this movement right now.
They're the ones turning dairy cows into roaming data points, right?
Precisely. And the financial market is throwing enormous weight behind it. The numbers being discussed are just staggering for a physical hardware startup.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, Halter is in talks to raise fresh funding that would value the company at around $2 billion.
Wow. $2 billion.
Yeah, and some of the financial reporting actually indicates the valuation could climb as high as $3.4 billion.
That's incredible.
Right. That means a unicorn startup is nearly doubling or tripling its previous valuation, entirely based on bringing AI into the paddock.
And the lead investor driving this funding round is Founders Fund, which is the venture capital firm backed by billionaire Peter Thiel.
Yeah, a major player.
When a firm of that magnitude steps in, they aren't just betting on a cool gadget. They're betting on a fundamental shift in how an entire industry operates. So let's look at the actual mechanics of what Halter is building here, because honestly, it sounds a bit like science fiction.
It really does.
We're talking about solar-powered smart collars for cows. It's essentially an invisible dog fence, but scaled up for a massive industrial supply chain and powered by the Internet of Things.
Yeah, let's break down what that means in practice. Because the Internet of Things, or IoT, is one of those terms that gets thrown around a lot.
Right, it can sound like jargon.
Exactly. IoT is simply the concept of taking everyday physical objects, in this case, a collar on a cow, and connecting them to the internet so they can send and receive data.
Got it. So how does the farmer actually use that?
Well, instead of a farmer spending hours driving wooden posts into the ground and stringing up electrified physical wire to dictate where the cows can graze, they just open an app on their tablet.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they pull up a satellite map of their farm, and they just draw a digital polygon right on the screen.
But, I mean, the cow obviously can't see the digital map on the iPad.
No, they can't.
So how does the system actually enforce the boundary without a physical barrier?
It's all through operant conditioning, using sound and vibration.
Okay, interesting.
The collar is equipped with GPS and AI-driven sensors. When a cow wanders too close to that invisible boundary the farmer drew on the app, the collar emits a specific audio tone.
Like a warning beep.
Exactly. And if the cow ignores the tone and keeps walking toward the boundary, the collar vibrates.
Oh, so it's a gentle physical cue rather than like an electric shock.
Right, no shocks. And the animals learn the association remarkably fast. They hear the tone, they turn around.
That's wild.
But the virtual fencing is really just the baseline application here. Because these collars are IoT devices, they're constantly streaming data back to the central AI system.
So the AI is watching everything they do.
Everything. It tracks their exact movement, their grazing patterns, how much time they spend ruminating, and it can even detect early signs of lameness or illness way before a human eye could ever spot it.
If a farmer can manage the movement and health of a massive herd from a smartphone while just sitting at the kitchen table, you completely upend the traditional labor equation.
You really do.
And looking at the macroeconomic trends and the sources, you have global food demand rising rapidly, but agricultural labor shortages are just a chronic crisis right now.
Yeah, finding people is incredibly hard.
People simply do not want to wake up at 4 in the morning to manually herd cattle in the mud anymore.
And that labor crisis is really the underlying economic engine driving this $3.4 billion valuation.
That makes total sense.
Private capital is heavily targeting solutions that combine automation and data analytics because the traditional workforce model in agriculture is just breaking down. Halter isn't just selling a collar, They're selling automated farm management.
Which brings up a massive paradox that we need to talk about.
Oh, the Teal situation.
Yes. We just established that Founders Fund, Peter Thiel's venture capital firm, is aggressively pouring money into this New Zealand-based physical AI revolution.
Yep.
Yet structurally, Peter Thiel himself has been actively retreating from New Zealand.
He has.
He is officially severing his direct business ties there by deregistering his local investment firm, Valar Ventures. If this technology is so revolutionary, why is the specific investor backing it, shutting down his local operations?
It is a fascinating contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand it, we really have to look at the rather turbulent history Thiel has had with New Zealand over the last decade.
It's been a bit of a roller coaster.
Definitely. Back in 2011, he was granted exceptional citizenship. Now, the standard requirement to become a New Zealand citizen is 1,350 days of residency.
Which is years.
Yeah. But Peter Thiel spent a total of 12 days in the country before getting citizenship.
Wait, 12 days? That is essentially an extended vacation.
It really is. The government at the time justified fast-tracking his citizenship by arguing his presence would massively boost the local tech ecosystem.
I see.
And to be fair, he did make $1 million donation to the Christchurch earthquake relief efforts that same year.
Right, which was a big deal.
And he famously referred to New Zealand as a utopia. He viewed it as this isolated, resilient safe haven that aligned perfectly with his vision of the future.
And he proved his investment thesis early on, didn't he?
He absolutely did.
I read he bought into a Wellington-based financial software company called Xero when shares were sitting around just $1, and those eventually skyrocketed past $90.
A massive win.
And his firm also invested heavily in a retail software startup called Vend, which later sold for $350 million.
So the traditional venture capital playbook was working perfectly for him there.
Exactly. But building a utopia isn't just about software returns. It's about physical presence. And that is where he ran into a wall.
A very bureaucratic wall.
Yeah.
He ran into the reality of local governance. Thiel purchased this massive 193-hectare lakeside estate in Queenstown, intending to build a sprawling luxury lodge.
Sounds nice.
But New Zealand has very strict environmental and landscape regulations.
Mm-hmm.
Local planning boards repeatedly blocked his development plans because of the visual impact it would have on the natural environment.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, he came looking for a fast-moving, compliant techno-utopia, and instead he just found himself tangled in local zoning disputes.
It highlights a real friction between that Silicon Valley libertarianism and standard civic bureaucracy.
Right.
But the structural retreat really accelerated after the fallout from the New Zealand Venture Investment Fund, or the NZVIF, right?
Yes, that was a major turning point.
For you listening, this was a taxpayer-funded joint venture set up in 2012 to support local startups, where the government and Peel's firm, Valar Ventures, pooled their capital together.
And the mechanism of that partnership is crucial to understand why it became so controversial.
Okay, lay it out for us.
The deal included a very specific, little-known buyout clause. It allowed the private investors, Valar Ventures, to purchase the government's stake in successful startups for essentially the initial cost of the capital, plus a really small interest rate.
Wait, so if a startup suddenly explodes in value, the private firm can just buy out the taxpayer's share right before the massive payday?
Which is exactly what happened.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When that clause was exercised, the taxpayer-backed fund made a modest return of about $10 million for taking on the early risk.
And deal's firm.
Thiel's firm walked away with at least $30 million in profits.
That inevitably creates a chilling effect on public trust.
Oh, huge backlash.
Because taxpayers felt they absorbed the risk of failure, while private capital captured the exponential upside.
Exactly. The public backlash was so severe that the government permanently banned those types of buyout clauses in future tech investments.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, that controversy, combined with the blocked estate in Queenstown, paints a pretty clear picture of why he is closing down Valor Ventures.
The utopian integration basically failed.
Right. Yet through Founders Fund, his capital is still fiercely chasing New Zealand's agri-tech.
Yes. It tells us that despite the personal and structural frictions, the physical AI being developed in New Zealand's dirt is just too valuable to ignore.
But here's where it gets really interesting to me. If private tech billionaires are getting burned or bored trying to build utopias and finding the regulatory environment too complex to navigate directly, who builds the rest of the ecosystem?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Because you can't have an entire national tech sector resting on the shoulders of one cow-collar company.
No, you can't. And that's why the New Zealand government has realized they need to step into that void themselves.
Oh, okay.
They are actively leaning into their own geographical isolation. They realize that their rugged terrain, their extreme coastal weather, and their agricultural dominance aren't hurdles. They are the ultimate competitive advantage.
So they're embracing the mud.
Yes, they are positioning the entire nation as a global sandbox for physical AI.
And the scale of this push in the sources is incredible. The government recently launched the Institute for Advanced Technology, or NZIAT.
Yep.
They are injecting $70 million over 7 years to build a national AI ecosystem.
It's a massive public investment.
They've shortlisted 5 distinct research platforms, giving them initial seed funding of $250K each to get off the ground. And looking at these platforms, every single one of them takes AI off the screen and forces it to interact with the physical world.
Let's examine the mechanisms of a few of these, starting with the Bio-AI platform.
Okay, what do they do?
Well, we often think of AI as text or images, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Bio-AI is using computer vision and robotics to physically alter the environment.
In what way?
They are developing robots designed to identify and remove invasive weeds with pinpoint precision.
Oh, wow. Which fundamentally changes farming economics.
Absolutely.
Instead of a tractor blanketing an entire crop field with expensive chemical herbicides, a robot rolls through the dirt, uses a high-speed camera to visually distinguish a weed from a valuable crop, and microdoses or physically neutralizes just the weed.
Exactly. And they are projecting an $840 million direct economic impact just for optimizing that one interaction.
That's huge, but how do you train a robot to do that reliably without ruining the crops during the testing phase?
Well, to train them safely, the government is tapping into a very unexpected resource, which is Hollywood.
Hollywood.
Yeah. Another of the funded platforms is the Creative AI Institute, and it's being led by Wētā FX.
Wait, Wētā FX, the Academy Award-winning visual effects company, the ones famous for those massive blockbuster movies.
That's the one.
How does building digital dragons translate to agricultural robotics?
Through the concept of digital twins and physics simulations.
Okay, tell me more.
Think about it. If you are developing a $1 million autonomous robot to navigate a muddy orchard and harvest delicate fruit, you cannot train the AI in the real world.
Right, because the robot might drive into a ditch or crush the trees or shatter its own sensors.
Exactly. The physical trial and error is just way too expensive.
Right.
So Wētā FX takes their 30 years of experience building hyper-realistic digital worlds, and they create a perfect digital twin of the farm.
Ah, I see.
They simulate the gravity, the friction of the mud, how the wind moves the branches, and even how light bounces off a piece of fruit at 4 p.m. versus noon.
That's amazing.
The AI takes millions of virtual test drives inside this perfectly simulated physics engine, learning how to operate safely long before it is ever placed inside a physical robot in the dirt.
That is a brilliant application of entertainment technology.
It really is.
But of all the platforms the government is funding, the one that caught my eye as arguably the most ambitious is the Aotearoa Agentic AI platform, or AAAIP.
Yes, their goals are massive.
Their stated goal is to augment the 5 million people living in New Zealand with 100 million AI assistants.
Yep.
So what does this all mean for the listener? Are we looking at a future where each of us has 20 invisible digital assistants running our lives and businesses?
To grasp what that actually looks like, We have to define agentic AI because it is a massive evolutionary leap from the generative AI most people use today.
How so?
Well, right now, you use a chatbot, it is entirely reactive. It sits dormant until you type a prompt, it generates an answer, and then it goes back to sleep.
Right. It requires a human operator to drive every single action.
Exactly. But an agentic AI or an agent operates autonomously. It observes its environment, learns from ongoing data streams, and executes tasks without you ever having to ask.
Can you give an example of what that looks like in the real world?
Sure. Picture a scenario in an orchard. A reactive AI could help a farmer write an email to a supplier.
Pretty standard stuff.
Right. But an agentic AI continuously monitors IoT soil sensors. It notices the moisture level is dropping.
Okay.
It independently checks the upcoming weather forecast, sees that a storm is coming in 2 days, calculates the financial cost of running the irrigation system now versus waiting for the rain, makes the decision to hold off on watering, and then simply sends a notification to the farmer's phone explaining what it did and how much money it saved.
Wow. So the AI is making prescriptive decisions and taking action completely on its own.
Yes, it's a massive productivity multiplier.
But let's bring these lofty, futuristic visions of 100 million autonomous agents crashing back down to reality for a second.
Fair enough.
Because when you look at the end user, the dairy farmer actually standing in the mud, which is detailed in Joe Ward's Kellogg Rural Leaders Report, the implementation of this technology is incredibly messy.
Very messy.
Yeah.
The transition from a flawless digital twin to a real-world paddock is exactly where the friction happens.
And the New Zealand dairy industry is the ultimate proving ground for this.
Oh, without a doubt.
This is a sector that contributes $18.6 billion to the economy, makes up over 5% of their GDP, and drives nearly a quarter of all exports. The stakes for getting this right are immense.
And, to their credit, farmers are not anti-technology.
Yeah. Oh.
Over the last 30 years, they have heavily adopted what is known as precision dairy farming.
What does that involve?
They use robotic milking machines, automated drafting gates that separate cows based on health data, and wearable sensors.
Like the early versions of Halter?
Exactly. And it worked. By implementing that hardware, the industry literally doubled its milk solids production per cow and per hectare.
But according to the report, that very success has created a paralyzing new crisis.
Yes. They have installed so many sensors and systems that farmers are now absolutely drowning in big data.
They're overwhelmed.
Completely.
Oh.
Every time a cow walks through a gate, data is generated. Every time a collar pings, every time a milk vat is cooled, data is logged.
But these different systems often don't communicate with each other, right?
That's the fatal flaw. They are siloed.
So picture the reality for the farmer. It's 9 p.m. They've been working physical labor since before sunrise.
Like exhausted.
Right. And now they are sitting at a kitchen table staring at 5 different proprietary software dashboards. They are trying to benchmark their key performance indicators, their KPIs, against other farms to figure out how to improve. But they literally can't get a clear picture.
It's what they call the apples-to-apples problem.
Explain that.
Farm A might have a completely different equity structure than Farm B. They might use different reporting metrics for feed costs or have different geographical variables.
So you can't just compare them side by side.
No. To figure out if a farm is truly operating efficiently, highly skilled individuals have to manually extract data from these different dashboards and manipulate massive spreadsheets.
That sounds miserable.
It introduces human bias, it introduces errors, and it just leads to total administrative exhaustion. The data is there, but the insight is locked behind a massive wall of friction.
Well, the Agricultural Leadership Report by Joe Ward highlights a fascinating operational shift to solve this. He proposes moving the industry toward a balanced scorecard approach.
Which is a huge mental shift for farming.
Yeah. Historically, farm performance has been judged almost entirely on financial KPIs, right? Like milk yield, feed costs, operating profit.
Exactly.
But a balanced scorecard mandates the tracking of non-financial metrics as well. Things like environmental biodiversity, animal welfare, and staff engagement.
And this raises an important question, because measuring financial yield is straightforward arithmetic.
Sure.
But measuring something like staff engagement or biodiversity is much harder, which is exactly where AI and machine learning becomes strictly necessary. You can't just hand out paper surveys to farmhands every day.
Right. So how does an artificial intelligence actually measure the engagement of a human workforce or the biodiversity of a physical landscape?
By analyzing behavioral patterns in the IoT data.
Okay, how so?
For staff engagement, The AI isn't, reading their minds. It's looking at the data generated by the equipment they use.
Ah, I see.
It tracks task completion times, turnover rates, or how often safety protocols on machinery are bypassed.
So if people are cutting corners.
Exactly. If the data shows a sudden drop in efficiency or an uptick in rushed, unsafe behavior, the AI flags that as a drop in staff engagement or morale.
That's clever. And for biodiversity.
The system might use autonomous camera traps to track native bird populations or analyze drone imagery to monitor soil health and waterway clarity over time. It synthesizes all these disparate physical inputs into a single readable metric.
But this brings us to the ultimate bottleneck of the entire physical AI revolution. It sounds like we're giving a pilot all the flight instruments in the world, but no dashboard to read them on.
That's a great analogy.
If farmers don't trust the tech because it's too complex or the customer support's too far away, does a $2 billion valuation even matter?
Not at all. Trust is the single most important metric here.
Yeah.
If a farmer looks at an AI dashboard that says, move the herd to the lower paddock, but they look out the window and see flooding that the sensors somehow missed, trust is broken instantly.
And once it's broken, it's hard to get back.
Right. If the technology is too complex to fix locally, and customer support is sitting in a corporate office 3 time zones away, the farmer will simply revert back to traditional wire fences and manual spreadsheets.
So if the tech providers focus entirely on achieving a massive valuation for a shiny gadget, but fail to provide standardized, simplified dashboards and reliable boots-on-the-ground after-sale service, the whole revolution stalls in the mud.
Completely stalls out.
The AI has to be resilient enough to handle the chaos of nature without adding administrative chaos to the farmer's day. It has to take millions of data points and simply prescribe the next best action.
So the farmer can stop being a data analyst and get back to farming.
Exactly. So to enthusiastically summarize our journey today for you listening, we started with the $2 billion virtual cow collar.
Using sound and vibration, yeah.
We navigated the controversial legacy of billionaire investors retreating from local bureaucracy. We explored a $70 million government push for 100 million AI agents in physics simulators.
A lot of ground covered.
And we grounded it all in the muddy, data-heavy reality of the modern dairy farmer.
And the overarching takeaway here is that knowledge is most valuable when it's actually applied.
Right.
The ultimate goal of AI in the physical world isn't just to make cooler gadgets or build a sterile utopia. It's to build resilience in our most vital supply chains, like food, balancing efficiency with environmental and animal welfare.
It's an incredible convergence of high-tech ambition and grounded physical necessity.
It really is.
And it leaves me with one final lingering idea I want you to mull over. If AI and predictive algorithms can successfully manage the unpredictable, chaotic variables of nature and livestock on a remote New Zealand farm, what other messy physical human systems are next?
That's the real question.
If they can invisibly fence and perfectly optimize a herd of cattle, how long until similar systems are optimizing the physical movements of our daily lives, our cities, or our workplaces? Something for you to think about.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.